I find myself drawn to people in the Bible who seem to live life in the extremes. People like Peter, who walked on water for about 2 seconds until he realized the big thing he was doing and started sinking. People like Jonah, who resented God's compassion on anybody but himself. And people like Naomi, who put her anger and disappointment and bitterness at both life and at God on display for all to see. Naomi is the Old Testament figure I have chosen to study. Who is Naomi? Naomi was a Jewish woman who's found only within the story of Ruth, which takes place during the time of Judges, a time of God's punishment on Israel for their disobedience. We know very little about Naomi. There is very little history or faith listed about her. What we know comes from Ruth 1, verse 2, where it tells us she has a husband, 2 sons, she lives in Bethlehem, and they move to Moab. What I gather from that is that Naomi was probably born, grew up, got married, and raised her kids in the same village. She probably lived her whole life within this community, and she raised her sons within the covenant of faith that community celebrated together. Until one day, when her husband decided to leave their covenant life and move to the pagan land of Moab so they could escape the unknowns and the insecurities of the famine plaguing their land. Perhaps Naomi was asked to go to Moab, but I suspect she was told. And it seems like she made the best of her circumstances. Again, there is nothing recorded of her 10 years in Moab, except that she gained 2 daughters-in-law from Moab and lost all the men in her life. So now, at this point in the story, she's a Jewish woman living in a foreign land with no protection and no provider. As a widow, she could expect a life of poverty with no one to provide security and comfort and stability for her. Though she was probably in her mid-40s and could have remarried, she was probably beyond or almost beyond her childbearing years. So she stands in Moab with no promise but the promises of God. Only she is mad at God, or she thinks God is mad at her. God had taken away everything good and necessary in her life, and I believe she came to a place where she felt she had nothing to live for. No husband, no children, no grandchildren, especially no grace upon which to look hopefully into the future. So she stands with her 2 daughters-in-law on the path, looking both back at her life in Moab and forward to her life in Bethlehem. I think her heart literally broke into its final piece and relented to its bitterness, which meant she refused to ask God for any blessings on their futures. She refused to ask God's provision for any of their families, and she refused to ask for God's salvation for any of their faith. Her bitterness at feeling discounted and disciplined by God finally overwhelmed her so that she could only wish these 2 women well without offering a single prayer. She is so consumed by grief and so overwhelmed by fear, it comes out in her words. She is recorded as saying, "The Lord's hand has turned against me," Ruth 1:13. "The Almighty has made my life very bitter," Ruth 1:20. "I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty, and the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me," both Ruth 1:21. So she gets to the place where she insists that everyone call her what her present circumstances have forced her to become. Call me Mara, or call me bitter. I love that Naomi isn't afraid to speak out about her feelings, but I hate that Naomi missed a very important detail in her life. Naomi thought she was alone and empty, useless and hopeless. But when you look at Naomi's circumstances, you can see she was actually very blessed considering her circumstances. In Ruth 1:22 alone, there are 4 pieces of evidence that show that God was still with Naomi and for Naomi. Number 1, she returned safely from Moab after a long and potentially dangerous journey, traveling up to 100 miles through dangerous terrain on foot with the possibility of bandits along the entire way. Number 2, she was never alone. She did not bury alone. She did not grieve alone. She did not pack alone. She did not travel alone. She had company. She had support. Number 3, she arrived safely back to her home community who were ready to support her and encourage her in her new season. And number 4, she had the God-given provision of the barley harvest and the generosity of Ruth to go collect food for her every day the harvest was going on. She was blessed. Yet Naomi allowed herself to be so wrapped up in her grief that she missed it all. She allowed herself to encourage Ruth to do something that could have caused harm and shame to all involved. She was so bitter she became blind to the dangers. Thankfully, God protected everyone from disgrace. And then God does something even more amazing. God turns her story of despair into a story of celebration. See, while Naomi was busy being bitter, God was working. And God was redeeming Naomi's losses with a new son-in-law, Boaz, who marries Ruth and provides the family with a new son, Obed. From the ashes of Naomi's pain in Ruth 1 arises a grandson, Obed, in Ruth 4. And Obed becomes not only the love of Naomi's life, but also the hope of Naomi's future. Even more awesome than her grandson, Obed, is that Naomi gets to be part of the story of her great-great-grandson. Know who he is? David. Yes, King David. For Obed has a son, Jesse, who has a youngest son, David. And this shepherd boy becomes the king of Israel and lives as an example of what it means to be a man after God's own heart, in both his humility and his flaws. See, God was sovereignly at work in Naomi's life the whole time, but she couldn't see it. Just like Job, maybe she was unaware of how God was working in her life. See, what Naomi did not realize, maybe ever, was that God was at work for the nation of Israel. And part of that plan included her. God was orchestrating her steps for Israel. Why do I say this? Think about it. If there had been no famine, they would not have moved to Moab. If they had never moved to Moab, her son would have never met and married Ruth, who lived in Moab and would have had no reason to venture into Israel as a foreigner. She would not have been welcome. If Naomi's husband and or sons had lived, they could have spent the rest of her days in Moab, which means she never would have returned to Bethlehem with Ruth. But because all the men died, she and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, where Ruth met Boaz. If Ruth never went to Bethlehem, Ruth would have never met Boaz, which meant Ruth would have never married Boaz, and there would be no Obed, which means there would be no Jesse, which means there would be no David. So because of Naomi, there is a David, and there is a Davidic covenant, and there was a Messiah who came from that Davidic covenant. And Naomi's part of that story. And that encourages me greatly to think about Naomi's story like that and to realize that God can take the hard and painful circumstances and redeem them in such glorious ways. See, never would Naomi have suspected as she packed up to return home, that it would be the start of a great future, one in accordance with God's plans. Neither do I know what God has planned as I stand in today and hope for something better, easier, or nicer in tomorrow. I do not know if my trying or hurtful circumstances will produce a David tomorrow. So we can learn from Naomi. Take heart. Trust God. Don't dwell in your pain so that it becomes who you are and how you define yourself. Don't focus so much on your losses that you cannot hope for what is possible with God, or you cannot hold on to the grace He is offering you. Believe God is working something amazing out for your life. And every detour, every tear, and every heartbreak are necessary to get you where you need to be to experience it. He's working you toward your David. And everything is working to accomplish that purpose. And just remember, if you lose your way or your faith falters, there will be a God-given Ruth there waiting for you to walk with you and support you and encourage you. Naomi did not realize that by investing in Ruth's life and Ruth's faith, that it would produce the bridge that would lead Naomi back to God in the end of the story. When Naomi seemed to have little or no faith left, it was Ruth who helped bring her back to the beauty, blessing, and benefits of covenant life by standing in the gap with the faith that Naomi had helped her develop. So what's the takeaway? Choose to count your blessings, focus on the good things in your life, and appreciate the people supporting you. Be a pleasant Naomi whose faith sustains her instead of a bitter Mara who turns her heart off from grace and blessing.